Today we're going to talk about George Victor de Noyer. And the name de Noyer is not immediately Irish. No, he was a Huguenot, and his family had come from France, as indeed quite a number of Huguenots came to Ireland, and they settled in Ireland, and they made a wonderful contribution, in my view, to many aspects of Irish life, culture, science over the centuries. Gabriel Béranger, who we'll see in a second, was a predecessor, in the sense of de Noyer's, recording megalithic tombs and dolmens around Ireland, and the preservation of the Huguenot cemeteries in Cork, in French Church Street, and also in Dublin, the Huguenot graveyard beside the Shelburne Hotel, have been supported by people who are very keen to commemorate and celebrate the Huguenot contribution to Irish life. Petra Coffey was very instrumental in saving the Huguenot graveyard in Cork, and she used to visit Cork regularly, and I met Petra Coffey during her visits to Cork. She was working for the Geological Survey of Ireland, and she had been working for the Geological Survey of Ireland for 30 years or more, and through those years she, if you like, maintained the flame. She maintained she sort of in a sense reveres de Noyer and his memory, because de Noyer had been employed by the Geological Survey in the 19th century, and when Petra worked in the Geological Survey, she came across so many drawings that he'd made, and literally hundreds, and maps that he had annotated, and she began to realize, as I think many people have, that his contribution to Irish life and culture in the 19th century had been very unfairly occluded, that he had actually made a very significant contribution to Irish life and science and culture, and indeed art. So what we're going to do today is really look at that. He was born in 1817, as you see, and this is a little self-portrait, a very characteristic drawing by him. It shows the classic view of the artist in the landscape, but it's immediately different to those romantic views that you're accustomed to seeing of the artist in the landscape, because the artist is recording geology, and he's top-hatted, bewhiskered. He's got a sketchbook, but this is in fact de Noyer. His self-portrait appears again and again and again through his lifetime, and yet he was also quite self-effacing. De Noyer never attended university. He never got degrees in geology or anything like that. He started as an apprentice draftsman and gradually worked his way up to being a surveyor. And so, he's not somebody who was sort of president of an academy. He was always more a journeyman. And when he exhibited at the Royal Hibernian Academy, he would sell his paintings in pounds, shillings, and pence, not in guineas. Guineas was reserved for the senior academicians, pounds, shillings, and pence. So he was very down to earth. And what for me is one of the most marvelous characteristics of his work is that he is so down to earth. He gives you an eyewitness view into Ireland, one that's really quite extraordinary. You think of the Dublin Society drawing schools of the 18th century. You think of the work of artists such as Thomas Roberts and Ashford, many of them producing topographical views. You see these views, beautiful paintings in museums, in the National Gallery, the Crawford, and also in country houses. And you're struggling to identify the view. You're saying, oh, is it Powers Court? Could be the Sugarloaf. Could be this, could be that. And sometimes they're imaginary. Often they're framed by trees, as Claude Lorraine would try to frame trees in that classic sense. And often they're sort of romantic in tenor. But George de Noyer is not like that. He's absolutely particular. He's just literally walking around, and he's observing little details, and he doesn't go for the grand effect. He goes for intimate portraits of people, of buildings, of antiquities, of all sorts of extraordinary range of interests. So he was an encyclopedist, first and foremost. He had a scientific mind. People nowadays are always talking about data. He actually was at the forefront of a 19th century movement of data gathering. He was transforming part of a process in which society was being transformed through the cataloguing of varieties and specimens of different types of things. Typologies were developing. Museums were growing, and the collections were being catalogued, and from the cataloguing came classification in botany, in natural history, and throughout. So he's part of a whole scientific movement. A silhouette by Edouard, the famous French artist who landed in Cork and produced these cutout silhouettes. And it's enigmatic because we have very few images of Noyer, very few portraits, again, quite self-effacing. The school that he attended was in Dublin, 2 Great Denmark Street, the proprietary school, run by George Newnham Wright. And Wright himself now becomes very interesting in this narrative because Wright was far more than a schoolmaster. And in 1820, Noyer is attending school. In the early 1820s, Noyer is attending school here at a very young age. And it's in North Inner City Dublin. But, the buildings haven't yet, if you like, become dilapidated in the early 19th century. North Inner City Dublin, around Mountjoy Square and so on, the houses were still generally in good condition and had not yet become the tenements you associate with plays by Sean O'Casey and others in the early 20th century. And of course, in recent years, then a great deal of restoration has taken place, and so 2 Great Denmark Street is happily there today, and so you get an image of his environment within which he grew up. It was an environment which was urban and educated, but his parents were teachers, and he was taught by George Petrie. The name in the 19th century would have been pronounced Petrie, but universally today people refer to George Petrie. And so this is George Noyer's sketch, made in later years, of George Petrie, who taught him at that school, the proprietary school. When you say proprietary school, it's a prep school, I guess. It was preparatory, but they called it the proprietary school. And George Newnham Wright published a number of books, A Guide to Dublin. Petrie did the engravings for them. These are steel engravings. These are not copperplate etchings or aquatints of the 18th century. This is mass production moving ahead in the 1820s. Suddenly tourism is on the go. Napoleonic Wars are over. Europe is open again to travelers. Steel engravings are cheap. They're very precise. And if you have a steel engraving, you can run hundreds and thousands of copies from the same plate. With copper, obviously, you can run about 100, and then the plate it becomes basically worn out. So in terms of the transmission of information through steel engravings, wood engravings, and through the classification of items, which Noyer himself was so expert at, from public and from private collections. In this case, you see he's sketching flint axe heads. And just on a side note, lots of the things that he was recording are themselves things that are records of something. So there's a sort of multi-generational aspect about learning and the accumulation of knowledge and so on. Obviously, because the flint axe heads themselves, as with so many of the artifacts that he drew, were themselves, they record their own making. So from just that point of view, it's not a simple typologically, there's layers of memory involved in how Noyer worked throughout his life. In the early 19th century, you have the growth of academies such as the Royal Irish Academy, and you have the Royal Society of Antiquaries. And these are learned institutions. They exist beside the universities. And the Royal Irish Academy today is a repository for several thousand works by Noyer. And people in the Academy clearly recognized the value of his work, because while the provenance is not so precise as I would like, these large volumes of his drawings, there are a considerable number of them, I think were probably commissioned privately for the Academy. I think it was probably one of the ways in which Noyer was supported by, not the Academy itself, but perhaps by members of the Academy, in terms of the fact that he had a large family, and he was existing on, weekly salaries of a few pounds. His life was never that of a gentleman artist. It was much more a journeyman artist, and the support of the Royal Irish Academy was critical to that. The Academy had been founded by a group of Charles of Charlemont in the late 18th century, and a group of antiquarians, including Charles Valency, whose books on Irish archaeology are just an absolute delight. They're largely fictional, but he did inspire a great number of people to embark upon the study of Irish antiquities. And Valency himself is just so wonderful when he's theorizing that I find him irresistible. The Egyptian connection of Ogham script and, ruins of Irish temples and connecting them with Middle Eastern things is fantastic. His theory that the round towers were Zoroastrian fire towers or places of pagan sacrifice, absolutely irresistible. Of course, it's all pretty much nonsense, and very few people today believe it. But Valency and many others were instrumental in really getting the investigation going. And Béranger, who I mentioned, here draws a beautiful watercolor of people measuring a dolmen around 1780. So this is the process of the beginning of the investigation, classification, measuring, and dividing into different categories of Irish antiquities. And it's suddenly in the early 19th century it becomes quite different. Suddenly you've got instruments like the Ramsden Theodolite, and these enable an extraordinary levels of precision in terms of surveying. The Ordnance Survey had begun in England. During the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland, it became evident that there were very few accurate maps of the Highlands. So Royal Engineers are drafted in Scotland to begin to produce very detailed maps. So you can say, well, this is just imperial Britain making sure that all aspects of, the Britain and Ireland, British Isles and Empire and so on can be consolidated under central control. Yeah, it's one reading. Secondly, you could say, well, there were so many areas that were uncharted and they had contained economic possibilities. So this Ordnance Survey was something that could enhance the ability to exploit resources and to improve communications and railways, canals and all of that. So you can read these things from anywhere. But what did happen was that hundreds of engineers and sappers were sent out with these theodolites and with other such instruments. This is one that I've took a snapshot of. It's in the Geological Survey. Very simple pole. You see the spring that's around us. So you connect it together, and when the spring hangs without touching the pole, it's perfectly vertical. So they're some very simple scientific instruments and some very complex, and the Ramsden Theodolite was one of those. The Ordnance Survey was completed in England at a scale of 1 inch to the mile, and then a commission led by Springrice in the early 19th century determined that there should be an Ordnance Survey of Ireland, and it was going to be at 6 inch to the mile. So Ireland becomes then, over the next 30 years, one of the most extensively mapped countries in the world. The mapping of Ireland in the 19th century is second to none in world terms. And the Ordnance Survey in Ireland proceeded on the basis of the townlands that had been established by Richard Griffiths and his boundaries. He'd done a lot of surveying work in the early 19th century. Griffith was involved in the New Ordnance Survey. It's, the Spring Rice thing is 1824. Shortly afterwards, the Ordnance Survey is set up. The Duke of Wellington doesn't believe that the necessary skills and aptitudes exist in Ireland, so sappers are sent over from England. They raised 3 companies of sappers. You know what they're doing because it now resonates through the whole 19th century Ireland. The play Brian Friel translations relates to the work of the topographical department in the naming of places. So they want to establish the names of places. And Larkham, who's assisting Thomas Colby in this Ordnance Survey in Ireland that flourishes now in the 1830s, Larkham wants a series of memoirs, large volumes, which are going to accompany the maps. One of those memoirs was eventually published. It's in the Royal Irish Academy Library and in some other libraries. It's an enormous tablet of a book, huge thing. And it contains a massive information, truly astonishing. And there was a team of people led by Petrie, and Noyer was employed on that team in the topographical department of the Ordnance Survey in the 1830s. And these are the surveyors, and these are the instruments that they worked with. This is a later photograph, but gives an idea of how it was done. The surveying proceeded by a system of triangulation, so the entire island is triangulated. Somebody once told me down in Castle Townsend that the Rocket House has an original triangulation point. I think that's folklore, because the triangulation began in Northern Ireland and proceeded southwards, and I've been unable to identify any point of one of those triangles that lands in the Rocket House in Castle Townsend, but I stand to be corrected. Anyway, the triangulation was the initial thing. It was done with those Theodolites, and then it was subdivided at a scale, as I say, of 6 inch to a mile, and it was most extraordinary. In the topographical department that George Petrie led, included people like John O'Donovan, the great Irish scholar, and Eugene O'Curry, and they were based here in Great Charles Street. His team included George Noyer, William Wakeman, and other artists who produced masses and massive visual information. So you had names of places, you had local history coming in through O'Curry and O'Donovan, and you had images and drawings and annotations coming in through Noyer. The house there, you see it there, it's got 4 wheelie bins and a rubbish bin bag right outside it, but it does have a plaque recording that this was the home of one of the most important 19th century scientific endeavours in Dublin. So Noyer joins the Ordnance Survey as a draftsman, and he's sent up to Northern Ireland where the survey begins. His sketches are immediately characteristic of an artist who's mixing the sort of sublime that he would have learned from artists who had been associated with the drawing schools, but also with an insight into just the geology and the rocks. So there's a down-to-earth quality in this early watercolor, circa 1827, that defines his career, subsequent career. He draws the fungi, the mushrooms that are found in Northern Ireland, on the Antrim coast where he's working. Apples. He goes to the Belfast market and he buys apples. He draws them with great skill, with great care. Later research has established that some of those apples were imported apples and were not native. This whole idea was to define a classification of Irish flora, fauna, geology, history, and so on. Nigel Monaghan, who is a contributor to the exhibition, points out that Noyer's meticulous drawing of the red Gunard is slightly anatomically incorrect. Well, maybe it was a variety of Gunard that's no longer been fished out, don't know. But he was doing his absolute best to record with a degree of detail and with exactitude, and using watercolor to produce paintings that are extraordinary. This is from a large volume in the National Museum of Ireland, in the Natural History section, which is led by Nigel Monaghan, and this is of a ray. So he's literally looking at what the seas can provide. Also, the archaeology, antiquarian studies became part of his remit, and he was throughout his life very, very involved in antiquities and archaeology and the research into Irish history. This is a Pilgrim's flask from Canterbury, and the director, Reinl, of the National Museum, told me that the pilgrims going to Canterbury would fill these flasks from a basin full of water in the cathedral, into which the brains of Thomas à Becket had been put after he'd been murdered in the cathedral. And the water was always replenished, but it was always a theory that, there would always be some little particle of Thomas à Becket's brains in the water. And this is indeed Thomas à Becket here, and that's a Pilgrim's flask. And this bell then, inscribed Patrici, ostensibly the bell carried by St. Patrick. Would that were true, but the inscription is later. but it nonetheless is a bell from our monastic days. Typologies of spearheads, typologies of axes, typologies. You can see the museum mentality really beginning here. This is very scientific work, but it's done with great skill. These are in the National Museum of Ireland in the Antiquities section. And you have then the report on the geology of the county of Londonderry, Tyrone and Fermanagh, for which Noyer produced a very considerable number of engravings. I'll correct that. Lithographs, not engravings. 1843. This is one of the few volumes. It's over 500 pages in length. It's an incredible volume, and it should ideally have been the first of similar reports of the geology of Ireland as a whole. But Portlock, who worked with the Ordnance Survey, he was only able to get funding to do one volume, which was a great shame. But it summarized and it did include many of the findings of the investigations into what lay beneath the green grass of Ireland and the cliffs and the basalt columnar thing of the Giant's Causeway in County Antrim. So they went through layers and layers and layers of rock, and they began to uncover the geological history. Now, this is important because in the worlds of science, the origin of the world had been defined by the Archbishop of Dublin, as we all know, James Ussher, back sometime in the 17th century. And he'd worked through the Bible meticulously and other sources to record that the world was created in the year 4004 BC by God. And it was done on a Sunday. He worked it out, it was a Sunday, which was very appropriate. And but these researchers in the late 18th and early 19th century began to look at the way mountains were formed and the way strata had been turned up and strata was being exposed, and when there was some natural cataclysm, sometimes whole sections of cliff were exposed. It seemed to indicate that there was a process of building up and wearing down, which was continuous. So this notion of uniformitarianism became a sort of new way of looking at the landscape. And the date of the creation of the earth began to be pushed back and back and back, particularly when they found plant and animal skeletal remains in layers of rock that were clearly very, very, very old. So nowadays, geologists know that the earth is many, many hundreds of millions of years old, and that there have been, so many eras, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and so on, Mesozoic. There was a period of the dinosaurs, and then, an asteroid hit Earth, and the dinosaurs disappeared, and these are recorded in geological time. Noyer is at the cusp of all of that. His work for Portlock gradually invested him with the love of geology, and he transferred from the Ordnance Survey to the Geological Survey as that was established in the mid-1830s. And Portlock's report is greatly enhanced with I think there's over 70 of these illustrations by Noyer of fossilized remains of trilobites and other, life forms going back millions of years. In Dublin, around this time, you have the sudden, emergence of geology as a fully fledged science, and the building of the museum building in Trinity College, completed in 1852, but in planning, for a decade or so before that. And it's absolutely magnificent. Woodward and Dean, Dean the Cork architect, and the capitals and the columns carved by the O'Shea brothers from Ballyhooly in County Cork also. So there's a great deal of Cork in this, a great deal of appreciation of stone, and what you get in Cork is an appreciation of limestone in particular as a building material, and also, through the various work of the deans and other architects in Cork, you get most incredibly wonderful examples of stonework, some of which is still preserved today. Museum building is a very fine building, Woodward and Dean, built in the style that John Ruskin was espousing. Venetian. It's early Venetian, perhaps. And it looks like a Venetian palazzo. But inside, it contains columns from every single part of Ireland, carved by the O'Shea brothers, representing the geology of the different parts of Ireland. So this building was built as a sort of a giant cabinet, a giant display case almost, showing the richness of Ireland's geological history. And it is a very, very rich geological history. It's extraordinary to consider, in the light of the exhibition that Niamh has curated in the West Cork Arts Centre, that shows the harrowing scenes of famine in the 1840s, that you have, palazzi and enormous resources being invested in at the same time, within the same years, as so many people starved and emigrated. This is a conundrum that it's beyond me to work out. But you have, in Dublin particularly, the growth of so many learned societies, the Royal Hibernian Academy, the Royal Society of Antiquaries, the Royal Irish Academy, and they're moving into wonderful headquarters, and there's clearly money not to burn, because these are buildings devoted to science and education and learning, but this is not a country in which people are, willfully or woefully ignorant. There's a great deal of effort going into trying to remedy things. Thomas Colby, who headed the Ordnance Survey until its completion, who was an Englishman who came to Ireland, he's so scathing on the aspect of government. He just says, the British government is just ignorant government, and this is a great country. He'd come to love it, and he recognized that so many natural resources, but the people were really put under what he just described as ignorant government. So that's just a side note in a sense, and it does also define famine today as we know. It's really all to do with governance. Noyer was on the fringes of this throughout his life, but also at the centre. He was on the fringes because he never became president of any academy or, was lauded with any sort of titles, anything like that. And when the Ordnance Survey, the Ordnance Survey work lapsed in an interregnum, he did some quite pedestrian work for the Irish Penny Journal in producing wood engravings, and he also recorded rock art. He'd work on private commissions. He did engravings for Hall's Ireland, that 2-volume wonderful book published by Mr. and Mrs. Hall, which gives a great insight to Ireland at the time. In that book, Hall's Ireland, Noyer is always very keen to record any little trace of Huguenot heritage that he can discover, and so the grave of Colonel Lachyamut in County Meath is one of the colonels of the Williamite army who was indeed a Huguenot. Stack Allen House was his next stop in the 1843. Stack Allen House, indeed built by a general who had been part of the Williamite armies at the Battle of the Boyne, is taken over by the newly founded College of St. Columba's, and this college has been set up by the Earl of Dunraven, and it's advised by George Petrie and others, and the purpose of this college, which still exists today, although it's in a new home in Rathfarnham, the purpose of this college was to inhibit or prevent the inclination of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy to send their children invariably to England for their education. This was to be a school in Ireland like Marlborough or Eton and so on. And to an extent it has succeeded with that. But more than that, at its very root, at its very kernel, was a sense of Irish nationalism, in the sense that the iconography of the school and the whole apparatus around it was invested in, I suppose, looking into Ireland, looking at Ireland's history and reappreciating Ireland's history. 1843. So what are we, 3 years before the famine? And schools like this are being set up. So, this is an interesting graph that you get of an Ireland that has a complex and interesting history. Noyer is employed as a drawing master at Stack Allen House. He's there for 3 years, and he makes a wonderful contribution. And at the same time, he wanders around the environs, and with classic, what I would maybe look at as a sort of Huguenot look, he's more interested in the old mills, the ruined farm buildings. He's less interested in the grand house itself, in the glories of its interiors, where there are plasterwork details with cannon and all of the panoply of military might and so on. Noyer charts the highways and byways, and he looks at typologies of buildings, and he's particularly fascinated with buildings that have been gradually added to, an old mill here that's been extended. But his folio of drawings, which were used as teaching aids in the College of St. Columba, are preserved in the Royal Society of Antiquaries. And but then he gets employed by the Geological Survey. So he's back, if you like, on a government payroll as a surveyor. 1837. He's following the railway as it's been built from Dublin up towards Belfast. They're moving quite slowly, but they've got as far as Malahide. The new cuttings made to facilitate the laying of the rails are exposing geology in an extraordinary way. And you see again, we see the figures up there on top of the rock. Gradually, decade by decade, the railway advances north until it reaches Belfast. His drawing is then transformed into a lithograph, and the lithograph is used to illustrate Beach Jukes' popular physical geology in 1853. This limestone cutting here is very similar to those exposed in the building of the new motorway between Cork and Dublin. And if you took the train now from Malahide, I've no doubt that this is entirely covered in lichens and growth and vegetation and accumulation. So there's only, and even in the motorway you can see already, the pristine stone and strata that were exposed 5 or 6, 7 years ago, they're now becoming discolored and growing over. So there's a sort of magic moment in the construction of these expensive and labor-intensive pieces of national infrastructure that allow an insight into the past. And Beach Jukes was the head of the Geological Survey. And like so many working in these institutions, like Colby, like Larkham, these are incredibly committed professional people. They give their lives to their occupations. They work literally, up to the last minute and produce fantastic, fantastic work. But also they're popularizing it. Beach Jukes, head of the survey, is producing manuals for students. These are popularizing it. They're illustrated by Noyer. Here he's down in Mallow, a quarry near Mallow in County Cork. And again, quarrying is exposing that. You see the illustration is used in Beach Jukes' manual for students. Beach Jukes gave lectures similar to what I'm doing here now. And Noyer painted large banners, and they're in the National Museum of Ireland. These large banners they didn't have Thomas and the marvelous video projector. They had literally an audience, and they had Noyer's banners, and they're works of art in themselves. So Silurian fossils, and introducing the public through the work of the Royal Dublin Society, a wide public to these advances in learning. Bag and Bun Head, County Wexford, Noyer lithograph. And this is not such a clear slide, but it shows one of the great fascinations of Noyer's life and work, which were glacial erratics. Those large stones left by glaciers as they advanced down valleys, and as they gradually melted, they just dropped those erratics, as they're called, on the landscape. In the 19th century and before, the landscapes of Ireland were littered with these glacial erratics. Unfortunately, most of them have been now removed because farming, they're an impediment to farming, and they were not like ring forts, or they had no association of magical qualities very often. Sometimes they did, but more often they were just simply regarded as inconvenient obstacles to efficient farming, and so they've been destroyed and blasted and turned, probably crushed into limekilns. Some do survive. This one is still above Kenmare. And in Lawrence's day, this is one which Noyer drew and visited and wrote about. It's a limestone boulder sitting on a sandstone bed, but it's about 500 feet above the river. So how did a limestone boulder the size of a house end up in a sandstone bed? local lore would say, well, there was a fight between giants and they threw these rocks back and forth across the thing, which is perfectly reasonable. But it was glaciers. They deposited these fairly gently, probably, as they melted, coming down the Kenmare. So that great Kenmare inlet, is defined by glaciers as well as by geology. On the opposite side of the valley, there's a sandstone boulder sitting on a limestone bed. So this is where geology really comes to life. This site today is completely forgotten, and it took me a great deal of time and trouble asking locally, where was it? Nobody knew. And finally, after climbing under barbed wire and across a boggy field, I found it. It's magnificent, absolutely magnificent, just above the Sheen Falls Hotel, and should be perhaps a much visited site today with the glorious view down the Kenmare thing. So Dunoyer is moving around Cork quite a lot. And that makes him remarkable too, because very few artists in the 19th century who are moving around Cork. And the Shiprock at Dunmanway, again a glacial erratic with a lot of legend and folklore attached to it, appears then in a lithograph after his work. He's sketching in Glendalough, as so many did. But you can see he's really interested in the effect of how the glacier had scooped out that valley. And look at this landscape with all the glacial erratics littered. It's probably now a smooth field. He was at Guggenbarra. This is a wood engraving. There's a number of wood engravings preserved in the geological. The actual wood blocks that were used to print are preserved in the Geological Society of Ireland, Survey of Ireland, GSI. Another banner that he did, the Burren, Terraced limestone hill. So as other artists of the period are, as I say, making romantic and, picturesque or sublime views of the landscape, Dunoyer is geological. His view is very, very particular, a standing stone in the landscape. And his faithful dog, Mr. Buff, a spaniel, who went with him everywhere. It's an endearing characteristic of Dunoyer. Here he's near Dunmanway, you see. And here's Mr. Buff. And look at the glacial erratic on top. Mr. Buff studying geology. Yes, that's it. And it's 1853. So what were conditions like, Niamh, in Cork in 1853, and Dunoyer travels on foot. He doesn't travel by carriage. He has a little boat, indeed, and he travels along the coastline in a little sailing boat. And, the risks he takes must have been considerable. This is 1850s at Baginbun Head. And it's quite interesting, because Baginbun Head is exactly where the Anglo-Norman invasion took place. It's named after the two ships. And so, even though he's working as a geologist, Dunoyer is inevitably drawn to his own sort of historical imaginings of the origins and history of Ireland. He was very keen, as were so many people in the early 19th century, of effecting a reconciliation between the Anglo-Norman invaders and the local Gaelic chieftains. This is something that preoccupied Walter Scott. That's why the Waverley novels were so famous. If you read the Waverley novels, you'll find that Walter Scott was attempting this kind of social cementing, this sort of political social cementing. Dunoyer was very much part of that too, as was indeed Daniel MacLeese. But so even though he's ostensibly recording pure geology, he's also drawn to what we'd call sites of historical interest. I see Mr. Buff has arrived, or at least a cousin of Mr. Buff. Ah, very good. And then he works his way along the coastline, often the little vignette you see, but it's anonymous. He's not showing his face. It's just from the back. There's 1850. It's Fethard, County Wexford, trapped dike there. He's showing the geology as it's formed, sandstone and mudstones and shales. Because where the sea batters the coastline, and that's where you really get the geology is exposed very often. And the Tower of Hook off Wexford, very famous, 1850. That's his watercolour of it. It's in the Society of Antiquaries. I would estimate there are probably over 2,500 drawings by Dunoyer in the Society of Antiquaries. Some of them small, some in sketchbooks, but others quite handsome and quite large. and Dunmahan, County Waterford, Old Red Sandstone, Cumshingon, that famous, lake scooped out by a glacier in County Waterford. And but classic Noyer, he's including all sorts of little interesting details there of a hunting party setting out with the dogs and the paraphernalia and the fishing rods and the guns, and so it's landscape, it's geology, wonderfully observed, but there's also a little bit of social history and so on. Where he begins to become quite extraordinary is in these drawings that he did, which overlaid the 6-inch map. So he'd be issued with the 6-inch survey map, and he'd begin to annotate it. And hundreds of these annotated maps are preserved in the Geological Survey of Ireland, and he puts vignettes into them to illustrate even with greater detail. So there's this absolute obsession with conveying information, recording, conveying information. I like these very much because the mapping itself is very scientific. The 6-inch map is being conducted according to this triangulation using Ramsden Theodolites. Then the annotation begins to take place, and various things are recorded in text and in script. So you've got a second layer of additional information. And then you actually have a vignette, a beautifully realized watercolor. So you have a third level of representation. So you get 4 different levels of representation of, what reality might be construed as. And this becomes quite intellectually interesting because it's unusual. And the maps that he produced, the annotations, as he walks the coastline, literally making all these notes. This is in Ferreter's Cove in Kerry. And it's just a small detail from, as I say, one of hundreds of these. They're still used today by the geologists in the Geological Survey because his recording was so accurate. And often with the vignette, he'll introduce a marvelous detail. So that's his little sailing boat. And he's got the Sovereign Rock painted onto the sail. And then he's got the Sovereign Rock as a map drawn and a watercolor. And then this is all on a 6-inch Ordnance Survey map of Oyster Haven, County Cork. And so you can track Noyer in the Geological Survey archives as he walks along the coast of County Cork and around Kerry too. And I think they're absolutely marvelous. They're a mixture of art. To me, they're very contemporary and timeless. And of course, they're a more conventional section through Arklow Rock looking northeast. He's doing much more conventional cross sections here. But those 6-inch maps are remarkable. And the interest in geology and the interest in work and people, ordinary people doing ordinary tasks, the quarrymen, the man carrying slates in his wheelbarrow. This is north of Waterford City. And, the dangers involved in taking the rock, the slate rock, out from underneath this overwhelming layer above it can't but be imagined. But Noyer, he's including all the detail there, all the detail of scales and carts and wheelbarrows and this machine, you see, a winch for drawing out, pulling out the rock. Most dangerous occupation, probably. Striated rock in Killarney. It's like a contemporary pop art piece. He's emphasizing the geology, but as the pattern begins to, grow, then the sort of foliage recedes, and you have these extraordinary works of art in which the geology acquires an almost baroque quality. County Cork again, contorted folds, and classification, lettering, naming individual pieces near Tonlegee and County Wicklow. And Comfrey Castle, it's just outside Dublin. Not a stone of it exists today. So among the 5,000 or so drawings of buildings and castles or tower houses, inevitably Noyer has managed to make a faithful record of the buildings of Ireland that are, now completely gone. He travelled in all sorts of weather. Travelled by boat. You see Mr. Buff. He was very keen on boats and ships. Ajax, the old Ajax at Kingston, 1843. A kind of remnant of imperial power that was given a safe haven in Kingston. He liked boats that were old and derelict. He liked buildings that were falling and crumbling. He was following the railways, the most modern piece of infrastructure at the time, but he also was capturing aspects of everyday life. Look at these people salvaging material from a shipwreck. They've erected a sort of temporary crane. They're hauling up material and planks and wood. The ships, probably at Arklow, you know, they're being battered by the wind. There's a rainbow. The big waves are coming in. And they're in peril. And this is a characteristic of du Noyer. He's always painting scenes that are not comfortable in some way. There's always an element of hazard, of danger. Look at this. Time to move on. No holding on. Gale coming in from the southeast. And so du Noyer captures a scene with a very particular amount of detail that very few others do at the time. Collecting seaweed after the storm. Marvelous details of towns. Hundreds of these sketches. People observed, travelled by railway through Ireland. First class, second class. You know, there's this type, you know, he's classifying. Wherever he goes, he's classifying. You know those famous circular houses, the stone houses on the Dingle Peninsula now? He discovered these. He discovered that city at Fahan that's now become such a famous tourist trail where, you know, the buildings not unlike the beehive huts on Skellig Rock, but actually they're on the Dingle Peninsula, and he wrote a paper. So du Noyer contributed papers to the geological, journals, and also antiquarian journals, Kilkenny Society and so on. This is a view of one of those today. He's up in Galway sketching the Spanish Arch, familiar landmark still today. And for those who love the traditional craft of Ireland, you know, these, or of these waters, shall we say, these derelict boats that he sketched in Dublin, you know, provide a wonderful information. Shoes from the 17th century. There was nothing that escaped his interested eye. Cockle pickers on Sandymount Strand. Almost, you know, looking just each one classified to the different type of cockle picker. Anatomy of fish, puffins, sharks, measured. This one caught off Tremor. The undersea cable. Completely alert to the possibilities of transatlantic communication. And yet beside it then an anchor made of a piece of slate wedged between two pieces of wood, the most primitive anchor. And we've got 2 minutes to go. And Kilcoe Castle, probably the only drawing of it that shows it as it appeared in 1850s. The Kedge Rocks, Castle Haven. I know of no other artist who's traversing this coastline in the 1850s, making these sketches. Lough-Ine, Glandore. This was the castle on Lough-Ine. And near Mitchellstown, Macroom. A Charter of Waterford. This is one of the Royal Irish Academy pieces. He takes a sail across Brandon Bay. A storm blows up. He records everything in gripping detail. And is safely home. But, you know, there's a marvelous home sweet home. Now, his final years were really wonderful and tragic. He died in 1869. He died of fever. He caught fever while he was working. He'd been moved up to Antrim. But just in the 2 or 3 years before he died, tragically, he's recording they see the railway from Dublin. It's coming, it's advancing, it's gone to Belfast, it's coming up now into County Antrim. The causeway, the rocking stone. He loved rocking stones. Are there any of them left? They glacial erratics that can be moved by hand. Mining in Larne. And then the last image I'll show, the boating hole rock at Island McGee. In the most improbable piece of geology, could such a thing exist? Was he exaggerating? No, there it is, still managing somehow to survive today. And the care of the Botanic Gardens, Society of Antiquaries, Royal Irish Academy, National Museum, and other institutions that preserve his 5,000 or more drawings, watercolors, charts, maps, is to be absolutely commended. Thank you very much.